Thank you very much, Clark. And now it's my honor to introduce Dr. Patrick Kyllonen, and he is a Senior Research Director of the Center for Academic and Workforce Readiness at the Educational Testing Service. And Jim already alluded to this great day that we spent at ETS, where Pat and his colleagues shared these really eye-opening presentations, things that we had discussed and only fantasized about were possible, showing us that they actually could do some of them. And today already this question about self-reports and the reliability of self-reports has come up. And Pat is going to talk a little bit more about ways that you can create to remedy some of the issues with self-reports. Thanks very much.
And that exciting stuff we were doing at ETS, that comes later. I'm going to talk about the kinds of things that I think are a little bit maybe less dramatic, but things that we can do today, basically. I also wanted to mention that a lot of the discussion we've had so far has really been about measurement, and someone made the comment, oh, that measurement is a different thing. But if you look at that model that was drawn on page 3, measurement is the whole thing. There isn't anything else. We don't have any independent, besides the measurement, there is no evidence of something like a skill. What would that evidence be other than a belief? And so measurement is really at the heart of the whole issue. One other comment was that we had this discussion about the general versus the facet data. The problem is that we have so little data, especially going forward, that we're really not able to make much of a statement about the measurement data versus the facet data. One of the strongest predictions of labor market outcomes is the Swedish enlistment study. The measurement of non-cognitive skill in that is a single measure. It's a single evaluation, 30-minute evaluation, one dimension, and that shows substantial prediction beyond a very good cognitive test in predicting earnings and employment participation. That's one dimension. So do we have any evidence that there's a single facet that outpredicts that? No, there's not. In fact, that's one of the best demonstrations of long-term prediction we have. There just isn't a comparable study. So anyway, it could be, it just isn't. But I'm going to talk about a little bit, I guess, more mundane issues of exactly what we can do to measure the kinds of constructs that Oliver provided such nice results for. And I'm going to focus on 3 measures, 3 techniques. I mentioned in the abstract 2, but I thought, well, there should be 3. So anchoring vignettes, ranking methods, and situational judgment testing. Basically, I'm going to outline the problems with ratings, and most of this work that we've talked about so far has been related to ratings. And then I'm going to talk about the 3 methods. The problems with ratings are motivated responding, and what I mean is you want to look good, so you present yourself and you say that, yes, I'm a hard worker, yes, I work well with others, or you might not want to. I mean, if it were a high-stakes situation and it's like you might want to look bad for whatever reason. Reference group bias is another big issue in this realm because we measure ourselves. If I say I'm a hard worker and I'm working in a setting that is filled with objectively not hard workers, that might mean something different than if I say I'm a hard worker in the context of a group of hard workers. Then response style bias, and this is independent of the other 2, and that's just a tendency to, for example, use the part of a rating scale differently. And I'm going to show you some compelling data from PISA 2012 that illustrates this problem. There's another, then in others ratings, there's a lack of differentiation. I'll give you an example. We recently did a study of taxi drivers in the Middle East, and so we wanted to show the relationship between a personality test and performance in the taxi driver realm. And so we asked their supervisors to rate the taxi drivers. And it turns out that in the taxi driver world, one supervisor will be responsible for 50 or 60 people. And guess what? On our 5-point rating scale on their outcomes, one supervisor turned in a set of 50 evaluations with coded as 3. No variance. All the taxi drivers are the same. And so this is a lack of differentiation that typically find in the schools. You typically find this in teacher evaluations of students and principal evaluations of teachers, that there is lack of differentiation on not just between people, but from different dimensions of student performance. And then yes.
Like what percentage of all variance in the test scores would be attributable to teachers' fixed effects or rating fixed effects?
Right, yeah. So, I mean, the big problem that we have is that there certainly are, I mean, in any kind of rating study like this, we will look at those teacher effects, those teacher fixed effects. And so we look at severity and leniency in ratings. And that's a huge problem. We can see that in some of the throughout the ratings data. I mean, we have ratings data all over the place. We have workforce productivity ratings and so forth. And so that's one problem: rating severity and leniency. And it's a really big problem because of the lack of differentiation between different aspects. So we just did a study with graduate student applications. And what we find is we had a nice survey of 24 items that measure the big 5 and all kinds of things. And we get, it really gets, it's one factor can account for ratings. And so what that means is that these rating differences, these teacher fixed effects or evaluation fixed effects, kind of swamp any kind of variability from one of the different, the various 24.
Yeah, I'll just toss in that in the situation where you have raters judging performances in assessment, coming in cold, there's often huge variation in raters, as big as there is variation in performances. But with training and examples, you can crank that down quite a bit. If you just go out into the world, though, and ask employers what they think of their employees, you don't have that opportunity to, spend 2 days trying to use the scale.
Good point. Okay, so there's this problem. This other problem is just you might want to call it the kind of subjective threshold problem. That is that you have two people who have the same underlying value and some kind of rating, in a sense, on the underlying trait, but they have different criteria for what they would, how they would characterize that value. I'll get into that in a second. Cross-cultural comparability, I want to start with this one. This is what led us to concern ourselves with these issues in PISA when we put together PISA 2012 background questionnaire, 2009. That was that in all the cycles of PISA's been going on since 2000, we find this curious issue of sometimes referred to as attitude achievement paradox, where you get positive attitude achievement correlations within a country. So your let's say esteem or self-efficacy or something like that. Self-esteem is a good example. Self-esteem is correlated with achievement within a country, but at the country level, if you just take the mean achievement across, say, 60 countries, and the mean attitude score or self-esteem score, you have a negative correlation. So the Asian countries who are high in achievement have low self-esteem scores on average. Some other countries have the opposite pattern. I'll show that. And here's an illustration. I don't know if you can see this in the back. I'll just try to characterize it, of how this actually works. This is actually data. This is a nice graph put together by my colleague Jonas Bertling, and he just shows 3 countries pretty much at random based on the PISA 2012 field trial. And so what you get is, within a country, this is the math teachers' classroom management scale scores. So students were asked to characterize their math teachers' classroom management, and this is their math achievement. So you see within a country, so these are 3 countries. Within a country, there's a positive correlation between teacher or students' perceptions of the classroom management and achievement. But when you pool these 3 countries, you see the correlation is 0, right? And then across countries, if you look, each of these points represents a mean, and then the correlation is negative. So we're going to refer to this as the between country correlation. This is the within country correlation. So this is the problem. So the question is, does this represent something real, or does this represent a measurement artifact? In some ways, that's an unresolvable question, but what I'm going to show is that if we change measurement around, it goes away. Therefore, I think it's a measurement artifact.
Speaking of country, if you do the same north and south of Italy, you see that.
Right. And if you do subgroups within the US, you also see this. That's true, yeah. Okay, so situational judgment, all three of these address this issue, and especially the forced choice and anchoring of vignettes for this specific issue. And so that's what I'm going to focus on. The anchoring vignettes, that was it's basically a method of rescaling Likert scale responses used in survey research. National Institute on Aging has used anchoring vignettes. PISA 2012, we brought it to the big scale education surveys. Let me give you a very concrete example. This is going to sort of walk you through it. This is on a teacher support scale. This is one of the scales in PISA 2012. And so it says, thinking about the mathematics teacher who taught your last mathematics class, this 15-year-olds who get this. To what extent do you agree with the following statements? One of the statements is, my teacher lets students know they need to work hard. Another statement is, my teacher provides extra help when needed. Okay, in general, teacher support. And then you're asked to indicate in 4 categories whether you strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree. Okay, typical, you've seen this sort of rating scale. So let's suppose the student says, I agree that my teacher lets students know they need to work hard. Now the vignettes that we wrote are ones that set up 3 hypothetical teachers. Mrs. Anderson assigns homework every day, every other day. She always gets the answers back to students. Mrs. Anderson is concerned with her students' learning, and then you're asked whether you agree or disagree with that statement. Okay, so that's an example. Mrs. Anderson is supposed to be sort of a pretty high in this characteristic, or should elicit a strongly agree to or agree type response. Mr. Crossford assigns mathematics homework once a week, always gets the answers back before exams, concerned about, and then this is supposed to be a middle level. And then Mrs. Dalton assigns math homework once a week. She never gets the answers back to students before examinations, Mrs. Dalton is concerned about her student learning. So in other words, you're rating these 3 hypothetical teachers. Those are your anchors. And now what we're going to do is just simply rescale the student's response to those 3 anchors. That's the idea. And so, for example, let's suppose that this is how a student A, he gets it, and he strongly agrees that Mrs. Anderson is concerned. Mr. Crawford is sort of in the middle, and Mrs. Dalton is below. That's the pattern of responses. And so student B rates those same 3 hypothetical teachers this way. So in other words, student B is using the right more part of the scale. Is that clear? Everybody clear on that? So now when let's suppose, now in the assessment itself, I'm student A, and I said, my teacher lets students know they need to work hard. Suppose I agree with that. What I'm essentially saying in the realm, in the space of these 3 hypothetical teachers, is that my teacher is like the middle anchor. That's what I'm saying with my responses. Yeah?
Wouldn't it be easier to just ask your teacher how often is she assigned homework? Once a week, every 2 days? If you're interested in how they work.
Well, here's what I'm interested in.
If you're actually interested in how much they get for homework, wouldn't that be an easier way to?
No, what I'm really interested in is my students' perception of my teacher's support. Okay. And so I'm measuring it with all 4 of these questions, all right? And these tend to correlate pretty highly with each other, and they're differentiable from other things that we measure. About 15 different scales like this in PISA, okay? All right, so anyway, so that's the student A, but whereas student B gives the exact same response, but what you can interpret it. Given how student B uses the scale, you might interpret student B's response as better. My teacher, he's saying, my teacher is better than the best of these hypothetical teachers. And that's the basic idea here. I don't have to, I think everybody hopefully kind of gets the gist of this. And so, yes.
Okay, so this is just an example, and you would evaluate many other dimensions of?
Yeah, let me try to, okay, so.
But exactly what's the nature of the, I understand the qualitative nature of the adjustment.
Here's a quantitative, yeah, here's a finding. Right, and so because I only have 10 minutes, I can't, so there's several ways to do the scoring, but there's a non-parametric way, which is basically what I just said, and there's a parametric way. And it turns out that they give you pretty close, similar answers. But let me just go to the findings. So now this is the recoded score, non-parametric recoded score. And so now what you see is that the within-country correlations, taking those same 3 countries, compared, this is the raw score and this is the recoded score. Within-country correlations are positive, same as before, but now the pooled data are positive. And now the country level data are positive, okay? We went from negative correlation at the country level to positive correlation at the country level. Okay, and in, with the actual PISA 2012, the finding here is that we did this for two scales. I showed you teacher support. We also did with classroom management. And so the anchoring vignettes recoded scale, the within-country correlation goes from 0.04 to 0.13, not much of a difference. And for classroom management, 0.07 to 0.20. But at the country level correlation with the 60-plus countries, 63 countries, goes from minus 41 with the recoded to 0.22. And then for the other scale, from minus 38 to 0.56. So it's a pretty dramatic change at the country level. So we talked about Asia and this sort of, so some of the issue about factor structure and so forth, you have to wonder about the degree to which that's determined by the measurement per se. When this kind of a measurement aspect makes such a dramatic difference in terms of what you would say about the Asian countries' perception of classroom management under anchoring vignette recoded interpretation versus a raw scale interpretation. Same with teacher support. So, I mean, one of the things we found, for example, was that the Hong Kong students were among the highest in the world in achievement, among the lowest in the world in terms of their belief that mathematics is important, their self-esteem about their ability to do mathematics, and a few other things like this. And so what this basically does is straighten all that out. So now that the within-country correlations are more consistent with the between-country correlations. Now, of course, they don't have to be. That would be an example of an ecological fallacy kind of situation. But there's no real obvious reason why between-country and within-country correlations might differ this, expected to differ this dramatically. We did have lots of discussions about the fact that, well, maybe in Asian countries what happens is that kids have low self-esteem because they have so much competition in the classroom. And so they see all these competitive mathematical, students, and so then naturally they have lower self-esteem about that. But so that leads me to a second point. I just, in the interest of time, I want to skip to the forced choice method, because we find something similar with forced choice. And the forced choice idea is very simple. You have a typical rating scale. I usually make a noticeable contribution to group problem-solving tasks, 4-point rating scale. I am generally forgiving 4-point rating scale, versus putting them together and say which is more true of you. That I'm usually make a contribution to group problem-solving tasks, or I'm generally pretty forgiving. That's all you do to make a forced choice test. And so it turns out that this reduces faking. it reduces response style vignettes, like vignettes, response style bias. Also reduces halo and horn effects. You can't see this, but basically this was PISA 2003 questionnaire. This was the PISA 2012 questionnaire. In 2003, the first item says, I plan on studying hard in mathematics, and the second one is, I intend to, let's see. Yeah, I tend to, anyway, but. Very good. Anyway, what we did here was we did the mathematics intentions, and it was subject matter pitted against each other, so math, science, and reading intentions. And so in PISA 2012, we asked intentionality for continuing something in higher ed versus in PISA 2003. PISA 2012, we put them against each other. So in PISA 2003, when we just asked people, do you intend to do further in math, reading, and science, they said, there was no correlation between that and proficiency. But when we turned it into a forced choice test, then preference for math was related to math proficiency. So, and the correlations between them all changed. So, yeah, here's the correlation. Again, this is the relationship between math proficiency and math intentions at the country level. It's minus 31, and at the forced choice at the country level, it's 0.32. So in other words, the trick we did with anchoring vignettes that made the between country correlations more aligned with the within country correlations, that is the correlation between the attitude variable and the achievement variable, that was replicated with the forced choice measurement. Okay, we get the same kind of thing. You have a question?
Yeah, a question about variation on the theme of the anchoring vignette.
Yeah.
That would make it susceptible to kind of call, and you could actually test somebody. You could in principle say, I've got 4 stories, and I'd like to tell you that the first one scores 4, the second one scores 3, the third one scores 2, the next one scores 1. In other words, you ask them to stretch out whatever their natural scale was to agree with a wider scale, because you'd like them to differentiate more. Somebody who's going to be nasty about everybody's going to stick them all, I hate them all.
Right.
And then you could even throw at them a test and say, here's somebody who's a little different than any of those 4 people. And they're supposed to be placed at, let's say, 2.5 is a consensus that's kind of roughly where they should be. And you could see whether they might internalize your scoring scheme before maybe going on to describing their own, filling out for their own teacher.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, unless that too much filled their head with stuff before they...
Yeah, those are the kind of things you do in training your graders, and you pay them $20 an hour to do that.
But you're saying that within the testing itself, you couldn't use the anchoring vignettes?
You could, but it's harder. And people, there's a real trade-off here.
Right.
Here you let people do whatever they want to do, and you adjust for it after the fact, as opposed to train them to do what you want to do.
Right.
And they often don't want to.
It seems like you have some real risk, though, going back to Theodora's point, where if you say this is a 1, this is a 2, this is a 3, this is a 4, and it's all based on how often they assign homework and how quickly they give the homework back, you're defining this, how supportive is your teacher by assignment of homework and when it's returned. And then if the student really follows directions, he'll then say, okay, well, my teacher assigns homework this often and returns it this quickly, so they score a 3. Right? So we worry a little bit about changing it from if the student feels like the teacher's supportive to does the teacher assign homework.
I mean, I can see the trade-off. I don't know how to resolve it.
Right.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, there is research that shows that where you put the vignettes makes a difference. So if you put the vignette before the questions in the questionnaire, makes a difference. And the other thing I wanted to comment is that, so I have some work also with PISA 2012, looking at the vignettes of the teacher quality, student-reported teacher quality, and I found the same results that you find. I also find that predictions with outcome variables at the country level, external from PISA, also change depending on whether you correct or not. And now I have been experimenting, we have been collecting data for a sample of adult population through an internet panel that they have at USC or UES, where we collected the grid scale from Angela Duckworth, and we were trying to build vignettes for some of the items in the scale that we thought were problematic, like hard work. The problem that we are seeing is that everybody in the US strongly agree with the statement hard work. So they don't use the 5-point scale. We have everybody 4 out of 5. So
Right.
I guess then if you want to build vignettes, you need to build a vignette exactly in the middle between 4 and 5 to make a difference. Which makes
Exactly,
it
yeah,
very
that's what you have to do.
difficult to
Right.
come up with an
Right.
scenario
Yeah.
that will differentiate what is a real 4 and what is a
Right.
real 5. So that's the problem that we are, it's just pile of data we just went in, but in a first look at the data, that's what it seems
Right.
is happening, that people
And so that's why I think that, so anchoring vignettes are very powerful. We certainly showed that in PISA. We saw that in PISA. But other methods are useful too. And I think forced choice is a really interesting one. There's a lot of varieties of forced choice. This is pairs, triples, and tetrads. Each item reflects a different dimension. You select what's most like you, what's least like you. So you can do multidimensional rankings like this, and so on. And it turns out that, just point here, that under conditions where you have same culture and low stakes, there's consistency between forced choice and forced choice measurement and rating scale measurement. In fact, that's more consistent than different item pools under the same format. So in other words, there's a lot of variation here about what extroversion means. Different item pools get you different variation, different. I think this is Neil versus the IPIP, for example. So what other point do I want to make in my last, please wrap up? I just want to mention situational judgment. Okay, so there's some issues here. I don't know, I want to make this point. So in forced choice, meta-analysis, Salgado and Torres meta-analysis, forced choice under conditions, which I'm glad to talk to you about later, have much stronger correlations with outcomes, 0.40, versus single statements, 0.28. That's the meta-analytic finding. So forced choice have a lot of potential for solving a lot of these problems: cross-cultural comparability, validity threats due to social desirability of responding. Also, national level correlations turn out to be better under forced choice. So there's a nice study by Dave Bartram where he compared national indexes, the UN Human Development Index, Global Competitive Index, and personalities of countries, and finds that forced choice, the rating scale versions of the data don't show as much as what you'd expect in these correlations as the forced choice version. Can't dwell on that too much. There's a couple of approaches now going on, one based on just Thurstone's 1927, a lot of comparative judgment, Thurstone scaling approach, and then another one based on ideal points kind of model where you can disagree or from above or below. So this is widely used in attitude research where you say, how do you like Obama's healthcare plan? You can not like it because you think it's socialism, or you're not like it because you don't think it goes far enough. And that's disagreeing from above and below. That's ideal point model. And you can do model personality items that way. Let's see what else. So we did a study at a graduate school in the US, and the finding was that the personality correlation between GRE and GMAT in undergraduate grades, in graduate school grades and undergraduate GPA adjusted R-square, 0.23, and then it goes up to 0.29, and then depending on how we score it, 0.29 or 0.28. So it's a substantial increase due to personality. This is something that people at ETS don't believe, this slide, but it's amazing. The raw correlation is, I think, 0.35. between personality and undergraduate grades at a very competitive business school in the US. That's under a forced choice measurement. Under rating scale measurement, I don't think it would, what the finding typically is under rating scale measurement, typically when it's high stakes anyway, it drops down to 0 because people game the test. Some people game the test and it's uncorrelated. You don't know who games it. So anyway, 1 second on situational judgment. I just want to show you what it is. One example. You're required to attend an early morning business meeting at a scientific conference. In the past, you had trouble keeping focused on these meetings, you've had trouble staying alert. What is the most effective thing to do? You can do what you can to stay awake, such as drink coffee or sit in the front row. You can read the agenda in last year's minutes ahead of time, so you're actually prepared for what's going on. During the meeting, read through the meeting materials. That keeps you, come to the conference caught up on your sleep or skip the meeting this year. And so this is actually a version of something that's actually used in an operational test for a university, which I won't name. And
there wasn't unanimity on the last answer, but keep going.
Okay. Anyway, the point is that these are very powerful ways of getting people. So you say, well, one of the drawbacks here is say, well, how do you score that? And so I'm not going to drag you through all the scoring means, but what we found is that if we use this item response theory model called nominal response model, which was actually invented here in 1972, which is a very general very general model for item response, and which basically exploits the wisdom of the wise crowd, which means that the most common answer is typically the best answer, but not always the best answer. And so what this method ends up doing under certain conditions is it exploits the fact that the smart people, with respect to the construct, tend to choose the most popular answer. But there are conditions, there are cases, there are items where that's not true. But you have to watch what the smart people are doing to see what the best answer is. And so you can use that wisdom of the crowd, kind of a finessed version of the wisdom of the crowd idea, to figure out what people think is the best response. And after all, in a lot of situations like this, there is no document you can resort to in deciding what the best response is. A lot of this is just human judgment based on what the crowd thinks. And this is an example. So I think that's it for my time.
So in the answer to the question, how do they become aware of the crowd, the group consensus answers?
Okay, here, so let me just, so what we can do, so what we do is we study these things like, they gave us, what you do is you plot the probability of selecting an option as a function of some measure of your expertise. And there's various measures of expertise. The authors of the questionnaire asked graduate students, about 10 graduate students, and so that was their measure. That was the expert key. But you also can look at the popular score, the most popular score, and say whatever the most popular answer is the correct answer. And you can also look at the consensus score. It's a funny word, but it basically means the percentage of people who endorse an answer. You get credit in proportion to the percentage of people who endorse a particular answer. And so those are all the X values here, and those are all the...
What do they know going into the test? I guess what I'm saying, what do you...
Nothing. I mean, all you do is you define a population. That's all there is.
There's no communication with people?
No.
Okay.
This is what people think. I mean, this is the idea here. That's why it's a very general measurement approach, because A, you don't have to know what the answer is. In fact, and no one, and you can't really figure it out unless you do your own study, basically. And so that's, but the key point is that you could ask things that you might not think there is a right answer for, right? So you're trying to get at, so that's why I think it's potentially a really powerful method. Do people use it this way? Not yet, but I think it's possible. And because we can talk about all aspects of human judgment in this context. And what you're doing is you're taking what the community of people, what you define your population, however, it's college kids or 10th graders or whatever it is, what that community tends to think is the right answer. Now, what the data show is that particular answer is, so we correlated that scoring versus other scoring. And yeah, it might not be a dramatic one, but this is the wisdom of the crowd, the wisdom of the wise crowd scoring. The correlation between that and a number of other factors tended to be higher, as you can see here. And not that much, but the point is this is keyless scoring. We have no a priori idea going in what the correct answer is. All we do is just take the wisdom. I mean, we basically fit the nominal model and estimate your ability from that model, and that ability estimate is better than several others that we look at. So. Oh, well, okay, so yeah, good question. Yeah, no, that's a great question. So this turns out to be a widely used technique in industry. Part of it is because you go to a company and you say, our country values collaboration and teamwork. So tell me about a time when there was a situation when an employee was demonstrating collaboration and teamwork. And so, the employees sit there and write these little scenarios. And now tell me, was there another situation like that? And those actually become the questions. And then you develop other alternatives that represent poor displays of teamwork. But they don't have to be that poor. I mean, they can be, what do people typically do? What is the range of typical responses to situations? So it's just a natural writing exercise. And then again, the knock that, well, you don't know what the right score is resolved because by exploiting, the wisdom of the wise crowd, so to speak. And so typically it's keyed. I mean, the experts say B is the correct answer. And so you get, 1 if you select B and 0 otherwise, or you can do very partial credit things. But you don't have to do that. So you don't have to a priori decide what the best answer is. You can look at the sample, look at the population. Now, yeah, you need a big sample to get pretty stable kind of scoring rules here, but yeah.
So just one second. I think we have about time for 3 or 4 more questions, and then the plan is we'll kind of break for 15 minutes to give people a chance to pick up their lunch. We'll come back, meet in here, and continue the discussions. So if we don't get to you, don't worry. You'll have a chance to talk, ask any questions when you have the presenters. And Valerie?
One just little minor change to that. We actually will be having lunch in roundtables in the solarium.
Okay.
And the discussion, we have presentation, if you have a presentation or discussion, but we'll be having lunch for the hour and a half in the solarium.
Okay, great.
So can I leave my computer here, or would you advise not to?
Yep, it's just right there, so it's fine if you want to leave your belongings. Sorry.
Okay. Someone have a question?
I just wanted to slightly self-serve comment. There's a fairly large literature in economics on cross-country, the analysis of cross-country data. You think about countries having common coefficients, different coefficients and the like. It might be useful in your efforts to try to reconcile or consider the distinctions between each of the country relationships to take a look at how that literature evolved in different contexts. The specific comment I wanted to make here has to do with thinking about heterogeneity. So one interpretation, if I understood what you're doing, is to say that you have a set of measurements and you need to somehow transform them country by country to render them comparable. And that was what the anchoring is. That?
No, you are doing this you could do that. In fact, we did that. But what this was designed is to make a person's response comparable. So the assumption is that there's this basic underlying trait of agreeability with respect to the construct. But people have different people have different thresholds of their responses and how that is associated with the underlying trait.
Let me follow up
Right.
that way, that the observation, there seems to be a paradox between inter and inter. One answer might be that the anchoring is country specific, in which case it would be useful to know if there's some way to do the transformation that
Right.
data comparable. But then the question I would ask is there an interpretation to the transformations country by country? Because I think that something that happens in this literature often is that all this heterogeneity across countries, let's think of ways to transform the model, transform the data, so there's comparability. There's actually the heterogeneity that's the object of interest. Play that out a little. It's one thing to say that each country has its own weights on the big five for some socioeconomic outcome. But, for
Right.
economists, certainly we'd like to know why the weights are differing, and is there a way to interpret that?
Okay, but that's very different. So what you're talking about is maybe something more like a construct. I'm talking about response on a scale. So yeah, the fact that Asians, and we know this from other data, Asians tend to use the middle part of the scale, no matter what scale it is, on any topic at all. And it's referred to as modesty bias, right? That's one of the response styles. Latin Americans tend to use the extremes. And there was a study, I think Oliver's student, bilinguals, when speaking Spanish, use the extremes. And the same question translated in English, move it in. So that, yeah, there might be interest in that, as a kind of a separate topic, but for the most part, that's noise. I mean, that's just the kind of the fact that Rensis Lickert did his dissertation in 1932 on this 5-point scale, and we've been using it ever since. It's not important, really. I mean, that's why the whole idea of doing the forced choice and showing, in fact, the forced choice shows results very comparable to the anchoring vignettes results. There probably are other methods. In fact, I think when we get to the point of using these games, someone talked about games for engagement from London, right? Or my guess is that when we get to the point of being able to tease apart the construct, let's say it's grit, from all the other millions of factors that influence your performance in a game, once we get a pure measure of grit, let's say, so to speak, and I don't know how far we are on that, but my guess is it's going to behave more like the anchoring vignette adjusted scores than like the raw responses. And it's going to be more like behaving more like the forced choice scores than the raw responses. Yeah, I mean, the cultural differences, that's fascinating. So we can look at, we could spend another 15 minutes looking at that heterogeneity issue, which countries, because it does tend to cluster. So the Confucian Asian countries tend to display this modesty bias, and they tend to downplay their own skills in the way they report on the scales. But when you readjust it for how they report on people in general, then that kind of issue goes away. And so it's in a way, it's a way of talking or using language, or I don't know how to describe it exactly, but that might not represent, it's not fundamentally a low self-concept, because when you control for country, there's a positive correlation between self-concept and achievement within Hong Kong. It's just that Hong Kong people have a self-concept that's lower than North Americans, or lower than Mexicans or students from Thailand. So,
But does that change over time in response to the way society is working? What about Hong Kong, certainly, say in 1900s?
Probably. I mean, that's a question of, is there, how does culture, what's culture change, right? And I'm sure that,
You're getting at that in these anchorings in some sense, right?
Well, certainly, it depends. It depends on the degree to which you take seriously how people, the words they use to describe themselves. I mean, what strongly disagree? Is strongly a word that, I mean, we get, Indonesia, for example, doesn't have any words for disagree, so it's all grades of agreement. And despite that, they're just agreeing with everything, they're just, they're very positive. I mean, they're way up on the scale. So does that say something about Indonesia as a culture? Maybe, yeah, right?
Well, at least on the public language, or the way they communicate.
Yeah.
I guess
right.
in the end you can say, what does the guy really think? And I guess you really can't.
Well, and that's where preference approaches are kind of interesting in that respect, right? Because you say, well, yeah, I agree that it's a great idea to go study mathematics, but if you want to ask me about whether I'll study mathematics or science, then I'm going to choose science. So that's the issue. You know, life is a forced choice test. I mean, we can't do everything. We have to make choices, and so.
See, that's why we're coming back to the question of context. You can imagine same questions you shouldn't get behind closed doors. Or do you really think you work hard and you're among your peers? And it's different from a standpoint. I don't know whether we really know how much that changes, just even within the culture, right? Where we change it. We think that we want to give ourselves. So, am I an aggressive person? I ask myself that, and I say, no, of course not. If I'm taking a test, I'm talking.
Right.
But a lot of people would say I am, and so and I would probably agree. So it depends on the format. So I guess that's the question.
Right. It depends on the format, and so.
So that's what I'm asking. What's known? I guess is how we can change.
Well, I mean, all we have, we have such limited data. I mean, to me, one of the interesting findings here was that the general finding that we got from one kind of change from the rating scale response is consistent with the finding from a completely different. In other words, the anchoring vignettes finding were consistent with the forced choice finding. And what they have in common is nothing except their deviations from the standard rating scale approach. So, that's so that in terms of the aggressiveness aspect, I mean, the theory is that you exist somewhere on this latent continuum of aggressiveness, and these measurement methods are just imperfect ways of finding where you exist.
Well, we're going to do a paper later today. It's talking about how even your concept of yourself might be strongly affected by the group you have to be with at that moment. So in that sense, there isn't a fixed scale. It's kind of a scale conditional on a set of environmental stimuli and peers and whatever else.
And then again, you have the measurement versus construct issue. It doesn't go away. I mean, I don't know, we haven't heard the talk yet, but you still have that same issue, right? So in other words, what are you influencing? Is that context influencing your responses on a scale? Or is it influence you're staying on a latent trait? Unless you have, I mean, the principle of, multiple measures to get at a common construct.
The meaning of a latent trait is kind of itself conditional on some kind of standardized environment. And I would guess if a person is in multiple environments, when this person's in a crowd, is this person gregarious? And when this person is alone with, say, a single other person, is that person also gregarious? I mean,
but you could have that, yeah. But you could have that in theory. You could still keep the latent trait idea and say that actually is true. Yeah. And you have multiple influences on a response, that one of which is the latent trait standing, right? So
the extreme would be like this Woody Allen movie, Zealand.
Yeah.
So wherever I have to adapt perfectly.
Right.
So in that sense, there is no latent trait. There's only a latent situation.
But look, let's not go there. I mean, come on. That can't be true. That can't be true, right?
No, I'm not saying Zealand is true. But I said there's Zealand-like phenomena.
But anyway, it's very hard to sort out the trait versus the measure, the manifestation. And so the context can shift one or the other or both. And it goes back to this identification problem.
Yeah, and one of the ways to think about these mechanisms that Pat's talking about is that whenever you've got like a rating scale and people are going to answer it, you can think of many artifacts that would affect what they do that aren't what you're interested in. And these are all devices so that you can cancel out at least some of those. You have plenty of other things to still worry about, but at least a couple that we know are bad, we can deal with these mechanisms.
But if our goal is to kind of predict them like a very different situation, so I really want to know whether a person's going to be a great pilot, for example.
Yeah.
And this is a very stressful situation because you have a plane chasing you. That's quite different from kind of a normal set of responses that you might get taking a test, in a classroom in a peaceful setting. So
absolutely.
So that's the question: is how transportable these items are to sort of different environments. That's really the same question I keep asking. So I'm just asking what's known. I'm not saying they aren't.
Well, I mean, there's a pretty good literature on, kind of cognition under stress kind of idea. Yeah, and in fact, the National Academy of Science just came out with Measuring Human Capabilities, and it has a chapter called Hot Cognition. Documents a lot of what's known under that with respect to that issue. And the finding is that really smart people can fall apart. The context can really dramatically affect people. You see this really with athletes, like the golfers who, professional golfers, they get into this thing where they just can't hit a putt. They kind of freeze up. I mean, they're incredibly skillful, and it ruins careers. I can't remember the name of it. I don't know if there's any golfing fans here, but the basketball player at the end of the game who's a 90% free throw shooter who misses both because of the stress. The game is on the line. Those phenomena really exist, and they're reasonably documented that cognition can be pretty dramatically affected by some of these stressful contexts. Soldiers in war, that's another one that's pretty good documentation about people who just, they're expert, marksmen, and they get in the war situation and they just can't even press the trigger, so, yeah.
But to just sort of what the relevant traits are for the task is
kind
of an open question.
Yeah. But we know that there's a huge effect for this sort of stressful context. And so, there's a lot of things like fatigue and, whether you're annoyed because of something someone just said to you or what, but the stress, the big stressful contexts have a big, seems to be a lot of, there's actually someone from Chicago here who does a lot of this work.
Sian Bela?
Yes, thank you, yeah.
He's here.
Okay. Oh, okay. We have everybody here.
Well, thanks very much.